Pretend to be my wife, a mountain man said, but having a taste of her broke his one condition. Clara had never imagined herself in a place like this.
She stepped off the small, rattling bus and stared at the mountains stretching endlessly before her. The air was sharp, clean, and smelled of pine. It was a world far removed from the crowded streets, honking cars, and constant hum of the city she had always known. Here, everything seemed slower, quieter, and somehow heavier. Every step she took on the uneven dirt road echoed with the crunch of gravel and the occasional call of a distant bird. She had come to the mountains to study wildlife, specifically the rare species of birds that nested high in these remote peaks. Clara had always been curious about animals and nature, but this was different. The city was full of rules, schedules, and deadlines. Here, the mountains seemed alive, almost as if they had their own rules, ones no human could fully understand. After hours of hiking along narrow trails, Clara finally reached the small village nestled at the base of a steep cliff. The village looked like it had been frozen in time. Wooden houses with sloping roofs stood in neat rows, smoke curling gently from chimneys. A few villagers moved about, tending to gardens or carrying buckets of water, their faces weathered but kind.
Clara felt a mix of excitement and nervousness.
She had read about these villages, but seeing one in person was entirely different. The quiet life seemed almost magical, yet she could sense a tension beneath it, a careful watchfulness in the villagers' eyes when they looked at her. Her first encounter with Eli happened that very afternoon. She had been exploring a narrow trail near the edge of the village when she saw him. He was chopping wood near a small cabin, his broad shoulders moving rhythmically with each swing of the axe. His dark hair was tied back loosely, and his eyes, sharp and alert, watched the forest as if he expected it to move. Clara felt a little nervous. She had heard stories of the mountain men, strong, solitary figures who did not welcome strangers easily, and Eli looked every bit like those stories.
She approached him carefully, holding her notebook in front of her as a kind of shield. "Excuse me," she said softly.
I'm Clara. I just arrived in the village to study the local wildlife.
I hope I'm not disturbing you. Ellie looked up slowly, his eyes narrowing for a moment before he spoke.
You're in the mountains now. Disturbing?
Depends on how you look at it. His voice was low, deep, and carried a weight of caution.
Most people who come here don't stay long.
Clara smiled, trying to ease the tension.
I plan to stay a while.
I need to observe the birds, the forest, everything.
Eli studied her quietly, then returned to chopping wood.
For a moment, Clara thought he would ignore her completely. Then he paused and wiped sweat from his brow. You'll need a place to stay, he said gruffly. The inn isn't far, but it's full most of the time.
You might want to find someone who can help.
I don't mind staying in a small cabin or helping around if needed.
Eli raised an eyebrow. Helping?
That's not usually how city folks survive here. Before she could answer, Eli suddenly stopped what he was doing and walked closer.
Tell you what, he said, his tone strange, half serious, half testing. I have a proposition for you.
Proposition? Yes, he said, looking her straight in the eyes. I need someone to pretend to be my wife for a while. Pretend to be his wife? She looked at him, expecting him to be joking. Your wife? She asked, unsure she had heard correctly.
Eli nodded, his expression serious now. Yes.
Pretend. For a few weeks.
It's complicated.
But it's important.
She had read about mountain customs, local disputes, and how sometimes villagers needed proof of family connections for property or legal reasons. Could this be one of those situations? Still, the idea of pretending to be someone's wife in a remote mountain village felt impossible, strange, and slightly terrifying. Why me? She asked carefully.
Why not someone from here?
Eli looked away, chopping at a piece of wood with sudden intensity before answering. Because you're different.
You don't belong here, and yet you want to stay. You can follow instructions and you're trustworthy. That's all I can say. I don't want anyone else.
She had never imagined herself in a situation like this, and yet there was something compelling about Eli's straightforwardness, his quiet strength, and the raw honesty in his eyes. Something about him made her trust him instinctively, even though she barely knew him.
What's the condition? She asked, sensing that there must be a catch. Eli's gaze sharpened. One rule, he said firmly. You follow the arrangement exactly as I say. No crossing lines. Pretend only. That's all. You get emotionally involved, and it all falls apart.
This wasn't going to be easy, but she felt a spark of curiosity. Here was a challenge unlike any she had faced in her city life.
And somehow she sensed that accepting it would lead her into a world she had never known. Dangerous, beautiful, and unpredictable. I'll do it, she said finally, her voice steady, though her heart raced. For a few weeks, I can pretend. Eli nodded once, satisfied. Eli nodded once, satisfied. Good. Then let's get started. The first days were strange. Clara moved into Eli's small cabin, which was basic but comfortable. There was no electricity, just a wood stove for heat and light, and the sounds of the forest filled every corner. She spent hours learning how to chop wood properly, carry water, and navigate the narrow trails around the cabin. Eli was patient but strict, correcting her mistakes without raising his voice, though his eyes were always sharp, watching every move she made. Despite the challenges, Clara found herself fascinated by Eli's world. Life in the mountains was harsh and demanding, yet it had a rhythm and honesty that the city lacked. She began to notice small things, the way Eli would leave food out for wild animals, the careful way he repaired tools, the quiet moments when he watched the sun set over the peaks, lost in thought. And Eli, for his part, began to relax slightly around her. He would tell her small stories about the forest, about survival, and even his own past. Clara learned that he had lost family long ago and had chosen this life for solitude and peace. He trusted very few people, and yet here he was, trusting her to act as someone very important in his life, even if only for a short time. As the days passed, the boundaries of their pretend arrangement became a delicate dance. Clara learned when to speak, when to stay silent, and how to read Eli's moods. She found herself enjoying the work, chopping wood, cooking simple meals, and exploring the nearby forest trails. And though she would never admit it, she began to feel a strange connection to Eli, a respect for his skills, and a fascination with the life he had built for himself in the mountains. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the peaks and painted the sky with shades of pink and gold, Clara sat outside the cabin, notebook in hand, sketching the outlines of the birds she had been observing. Eli joined her, sitting quietly on a log nearby. Neither spoke at first. The silence was comfortable, filled only with the sounds of the forest. The rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl, the wind brushing against the trees. "You're learning fast," Eli said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, almost approving. Clara looked up and smiled. "I'm trying." "I want to do this right," he nodded. Then added, "Most people don't last a week here. They leave after the first cold night or when the chores pile up. You stay. That counts for something." Clara felt a warm rush of pride. For the first time, she wasn't thinking about city life or deadlines. She was thinking about survival, about learning, about understanding a world so different from her own. And though she would not say it aloud, she was beginning to realize that the mountains and the man who lived in them had changed her more than she could yet understand. As night fell and the stars appeared one by one in the clear sky, Clara felt a strange mixture of fear and excitement. She was far from home, living a life she had never imagined, following rules she did not fully understand, and sharing space with someone as enigmatic as Eli. Yet there was a promise in the air, a sense that the mountains had stories to tell, and she had just begun to listen. And so, the pretend arrangement began. A city woman, curious and brave, had stepped into a world of mountains and solitude.
A mountain man, gruff yet deeply guarded, had opened his life to a stranger. Both were unsure where this path would lead, but for now they had one thing in common: the unspoken understanding that life here would change them in ways neither of them could yet predict.
Life in the mountains was unlike anything Clara had ever known. The days were long, the work demanding, and the quiet was almost deafening at first.
Each morning she woke to the sound of birdsong and the crisp chill that crept through the cracks in the cabin walls. She would dress quickly in layers of wool and canvas, light the stove, and begin her chores before the sun had fully risen.
Chopping wood, fetching water from the nearby stream, and preparing simple meals kept her hands busy and her mind focused, but every task also reminded her of how far removed she was from the life she had left behind.
Eli, as always, moved with a quiet efficiency that Clara could not match at first.
He had a rhythm to his day that seemed effortless. He chopped wood, repaired tools, tended to the small garden, and hunted or trapped when necessary. Watching him work, Clara realized that survival in the mountains was not a skill you could learn from books.
It required patience, observation, and an instinct that only came from years of living in such a harsh environment. "Hold the axe closer to your hands," Eli instructed one morning, observing her swing. "You're putting too much strength into it. Control comes from the motion, not the force."
Clara adjusted her grip, trying again, and felt the wood split cleanly with a satisfying crack. She smiled, proud of the small success.
"Like this?" she asked. "Better," Eli said, his eyes narrowing slightly, not quite smiling but approving. "Keep practicing and you'll be as strong as you think you are."
That was the way life went in the mountains. Small victories, constant lessons, and subtle acknowledgments of progress. Clara learned quickly that Ellie was not the kind of man to offer praise lightly, but when he did, their days settled into a routine. Clara would spend the mornings assisting with chores and exploring the trails around the cabin. She would note the birds she spotted, sketching them in her notebook, and sometimes climb higher along the rocky paths to observe nests tucked in hard-to-reach spots. The afternoons were often spent repairing equipment, mending clothes, or helping Eli with tasks that required careful attention.
In the evenings, they would cook simple meals together over the wood stove and eat in companionable silence, listening to the wind sweep through the trees. Despite the simplicity, Clara found herself fascinated by the way Eli's mind worked.
He had an incredible knowledge of the forest, of animal behavior, of weather patterns. He could tell when a storm was coming just by the smell of the air and the color of the sky. He knew which berries were safe to eat, which plants could heal a cut or soothe a sore throat. Clara had studied animals in classrooms and labs, but here she was learning about life itself, and the lessons were far more intense and immediate. One afternoon, while they were gathering firewood, Eli suddenly stopped and crouched low. Clara froze beside him, unsure what had caught his attention.
"See that?"
he whispered, pointing toward a dense thicket. A small red fox peeked out from behind a bush, its eyes bright and curious.
Clara held her breath, watching the fox as it sniffed the air and darted along the edge of the forest.
"It's beautiful," she whispered back.
Eli nodded, beautiful and smart.
"It knows these woods better than any human. That's why it survives."
Moments like this reminded Clara why she had come to the mountains in the first place, to study wildlife. But it also made her realize that the human side of the forest, Eli himself, was just as fascinating. He was a mystery she was slowly unraveling, and though he rarely spoke of himself directly, every action revealed more than words ever could.
As the days turned into weeks, Clara noticed small changes in herself.
She had never considered herself particularly strong, but now she carried water buckets, chopped wood, and hiked steep trails without hesitation. She had learned patience and attention to detail. She had learned how to move quietly, how to observe without disturbing, and how to read signs in the forest that most people would miss. Each day was a challenge, but it also left her feeling more capable and confident than she had ever felt in the city. Eli, too, seemed to change in subtle ways. He was still gruff, still cautious, but Clara began to see moments of warmth and humor that he rarely displayed. Sometimes, when she made a mistake with the chores or accidentally startled an animal, he would shake his head and mutter under his breath, but there was a hint of amusement in his eyes. Other times, he would quietly leave her a cup of tea or a warm blanket without saying a word. And Clara realized he was observing her comfort in ways he did not express directly. One evening, after a particularly long day of hiking to check bird nests and gathering firewood, Clara sat by the cabin's door, exhausted but exhilarated. Eli joined her, sitting on the log beside her with a small flask of water. They watched the sun sink behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. "You're getting stronger," Eli said quietly.
Faster, steadier. Not bad for a city girl.
Clara laughed softly. I think the mountains are stronger than me, but I'm trying.
Eli's expression softened just slightly, and he nodded.
Trying is what matters. There were moments, too, that challenged the boundaries of their agreement.
Clara had been careful to follow Ellie's rules, pretend only, no emotional involvement, but living in such close proximity, sharing meals, working together, and relying on each other for safety made it impossible to remain entirely detached.
She found herself caring about his comfort, noticing when he was tired or irritated, and silently hoping he would be safe when he went into the forest alone. Eli, despite his warnings, began to show subtle signs of trust.
He would share small details of his past, stories about the village, and even his thoughts about life in general. He rarely spoke of feelings, but the quiet moments they spent together, the shared work, the meals, the watching of sunsets, created a bond that neither could ignore. One night, a storm rolled in unexpectedly. The wind howled and rain pelted the cabin walls, rattling the windows and making the small structure creak. Clara, who had never experienced a mountain storm before, felt a flicker of fear. Eli, however, moved calmly, securing the windows, stoking the fire, and making sure she was safe.
You'll be fine, he said, his voice steady. The cabin can handle this. Just stay close to the fire.
Clara nodded, grateful for his presence. For the first time, she realized how much she relied on him, not just for survival, but for a sense of security. It was an unfamiliar feeling, but not unpleasant. The storm lasted most of the night, and by morning the forest was soaked, the trails muddy, but the air smelled fresh and alive. Clara and Eli worked together to repair minor damage and clear debris, moving in rhythm as if they had always been partners. As they rested later that afternoon, Eli spoke for the first time about why he had chosen solitude. "I lost people I cared about," he said quietly, staring at the distant mountains.
It made me realize I couldn't depend on anyone, so I chose this life. Simple, isolated.
Clara listened, understanding that his gruff exterior was a shield, protecting him from pain he had experienced before.
I think, even in isolation, people still need connection, she said softly. Even if it's small. Even if it's unexpected. Ellie looked at her, eyes thoughtful. Or maybe I'm just too stubborn to admit it. There was a pause, comfortable and unforced.
Clara realized that despite their agreement, despite the rules and boundaries, a quiet trust and respect had formed between them. She was beginning to understand the mountain man not just as a mystery, but as a real person, with fears, strengths, and vulnerabilities.
Life continued in this rhythm. They worked, explored, and survived together.
Clara learned how to fish in the small streams, how to track animals by the signs they left behind, and even how to navigate the forest at dusk without losing her way. Eli, in turn, began to show her the small wonders of the mountains, hidden waterfalls, rare birds, and the quiet beauty of a world untouched by human chaos. One afternoon, while gathering herbs near a small clearing, Clara slipped on a wet rock and fell. She cried out as her ankle twisted sharply. Eli was instantly at her side, helping her to a safe spot and examining the injury.
You're going to be fine, he said firmly, wrapping her ankle with a cloth from his pack. But no more careless moves. I'm trying my best.
Eli's eyes softened, and for a moment he did not speak, simply watching her. Clara felt a strange warmth, a sense that he cared more than he had ever admitted. As the sun set that evening, Clara reflected on how much her life had changed in just a few weeks. She had come to the mountains as an outsider, expecting to study wildlife and survive on her own. Instead, she had found a world of challenges, lessons, and unexpected connections. Eli, the mountain man she was pretending to be married to, was slowly revealing himself, not just as a rugged figure of the wilderness, but as a human being with depth and heart. And though they had both agreed to boundaries, Clara knew that the time they spent together, the shared work, and the quiet moments of trust were slowly breaking down the walls between them. The pretend arrangement was evolving in ways neither of them could fully predict, and the mountains held their secrets, their lessons, and perhaps their beginnings. The days in the mountains had grown colder, and the first signs of winter were creeping over the peaks. Clara noticed the mornings coming earlier and the nights stretching longer, with frost forming on the edges of the cabin windows.
The air was sharper, the wind biting through even the thickest woolen layers. Yet despite the cold, life had taken on a rhythm, almost like a living pulse that Clara had grown used to. Each day brought its own challenges, but it also brought moments of quiet beauty that she cherished.
Eli continued to be the same gruff, efficient man she had come to know, but Clara could see subtle changes in him.
He was still reserved, still careful with words, but there were moments now when he would linger in her presence, just watching her, or allow a small smile to escape when something amused him.
It was confusing to Clara, because she had come here with the understanding that their arrangement was temporary, pretend, and strictly bound by rules. Yet she found herself thinking about him often, wondering what he was doing, and hoping he was safe during his solitary excursions into the forest. One day, as Clara helped Eli repair a section of the cabin roof damaged by a recent storm, the sky suddenly darkened. Thick clouds rolled in, and a sharp wind began to gust through the trees. Eli squinted at the sky, his instincts kicking in.
"We need to finish quickly,"
he said, his voice steady but urgent.
"A storm's coming, and it won't be easy."
Clara worked as quickly as she could, holding nails and passing tools. She noticed the way Eli moved with purpose, precise and unhurried despite the growing wind. There was a quiet strength in him that was hard to describe. He seemed at once vulnerable, because he lived alone, yet invincible in the way he handled the mountain's challenges. As the first drops of rain began to fall, Eli made a decision.
"Come on! Inside, now!"
He helped her down from the roof and into the cabin. Once inside, he closed the shutters, started the stove, and checked their supplies. The storm outside intensified quickly, with heavy rain and howling wind that rattled the wooden walls. Clara watched him as he worked, realizing just how much she depended on his knowledge and calm. Hours passed with the storm raging, and they found themselves confined to the small cabin. Clara tried to keep herself busy by reading her notes and sketching birds, but the atmosphere was tense. The wind rattled the windows, and she couldn't help but glance at Eli, noticing how carefully he monitored the cabin, moving quietly and efficiently. He seemed almost relaxed, but there was a focus in his eyes that told her he was ready for anything. At one point, a loud crack of thunder made Clara jump. Eli immediately moved to the window, peering out, then returned and handed her a warm blanket.
"It's going to be okay,"
he said quietly. His voice had an unusual softness, and Clara felt a strange warmth, knowing he was watching out for her. The storm continued through the night, and by morning the forest was wet and shimmering under a gray sky. Trees leaned slightly from the wind, and debris was scattered along the paths. Clara and Eli set about clearing the trails and repairing minor damage around the cabin. As they worked, they moved in a quiet rhythm, each understanding the other's movements without words. It was in these moments that Clara felt the boundary of their pretend arrangement beginning to blur. She cared about Eli's safety more than she wanted to admit, and she realized that the thought of him being hurt while she could not help filled her with unease. A few days later, they set out on a hike to check a distant bird nesting area. The trail was steep and narrow, and the air was cold and thin. Clara struggled to keep up, her lungs burning with each step, while Eli moved ahead with practiced ease.
At one point, she stumbled on loose gravel, catching herself just before she fell. "Careful," Eli said sharply, reaching out to steady her.
Their hands brushed, and Clara felt a jolt she couldn't explain. She looked up at him, and for a brief moment their eyes met in a silent understanding, an acknowledgement that their connection was changing. They reached the nesting area, high on a rocky ledge overlooking the valley. The view was breathtaking. Mountains stretching endlessly, their peaks dusted with early snow, and the valley below blanketed in autumn colors. Clara's breath caught in her throat at the beauty, but she also noticed the subtle tension in Eli. He was scanning the forest constantly, checking for danger, his body alert even in the awe-inspiring silence. As she observed the birds taking notes and sketching their movements, Clara realized that she was no longer just an observer of the forest. She was part of it. The mountains, the wildlife, and even Eli had become intertwined with her life in a way she had never anticipated. On the hike back, the weather suddenly shifted. Dark clouds formed again, and a light snow began to fall, dusting the trees and paths. Visibility dropped quickly, and the trail became slippery. Clara struggled to keep up, and Eli noticed immediately. "You're slowing down," he said, his voice firm but concerned.
We need to stick together. One mistake, and it could be dangerous.
She hated being dependent on him, yet she couldn't deny that his presence made her feel safer. The snow fell heavier, and soon they were trudging through knee-deep drifts. Eli held her hand at one point, guiding her over a particularly treacherous patch of ice. By the time they reached the cabin, they were both cold and exhausted.
Clara quickly removed her wet clothes and warmed herself by the fire, while Eli checked the cabin and ensured that everything was secure.
That evening, as they sat near the stove, a quiet tension filled the air.
Clara wanted to speak, to acknowledge the shift in their relationship, but she didn't know how. Instead, she watched him, noticing the way he carefully removed his wet boots, his movements precise and deliberate.
"You did well today," Eli said finally, his voice softer than usual. "Better than I expected." Clara smiled faintly.
"I had good guidance." Eli's eyes met hers, and for a moment there was silence. Clara felt a strange mixture of emotions, gratitude, admiration, and something more. Something she wasn't ready to name. She realized that the boundaries they had agreed upon were already shifting, subtly, almost imperceptibly, but undeniably.
Clara found herself looking for Eli in the mornings, anticipating his instructions and guidance. She listened carefully to his words, noticed the smallest gestures, and even anticipated his movements during chores. She realized that she was emotionally invested despite herself. Eli, too, seemed to respond differently.
He began to share more about his past, telling her stories of his childhood, his family, and the events that had led him to the mountains. He spoke carefully, as if testing her, gauging her reactions, and slowly, Clara felt that he trusted her with parts of himself he had never shown anyone before.
One afternoon, as they repaired a broken fence along the edge of the property, Clara slipped again on the icy ground. Eli was instantly at her side, helping her up. This time, their hands lingered slightly longer than necessary, and Clara felt a warmth spread through her chest. She looked up at him, and he met her gaze, his expression unreadable but intense.
"Careful," he said quietly, almost a whisper. But there was something in his tone that made Clara's heart race.
As winter approached, the mountains grew harsher, and the challenges increased. Clara realized that survival here depended not just on skill, but on trust.
She had to trust Eli completely, and she sensed that he too was beginning to trust her in ways he had not expected. One evening, after a long day of chopping wood and clearing trails, they sat outside the cabin, wrapped in blankets, watching the stars appear in the clear, cold sky.
The silence between them was comfortable, yet charged with unspoken emotions.
"You're different now," Eli said finally, breaking the quiet.
Not the same city girl who came here weeks ago. You've learned, adapted, survived, and I didn't expect to notice, but I do.
"I've learned a lot from you," she admitted softly. "More than I expected."
"More than I even thought I needed." Eli's gaze softened, and for the first time Clara felt that he was not just speaking to her as a guide or teacher, but as someone who cared deeply.
The unspoken bond between them had grown stronger, and the pretend arrangement was evolving into something neither of them could deny. That night, as they prepared for the long winter ahead, Clara realized that she had crossed a line she had not intended to.
The pretend marriage, the rules and boundaries, they were no longer enough to contain the connection that had formed.
She thought about Eli's strength, his vulnerability, and the moments of quiet trust they had shared. And she knew deep in her heart that the mountains had changed her, and that Eli, too, had changed in ways neither of them had anticipated.
For the first time, Clara understood that the mountains were not just a place of survival. They were a place of transformation.
And in the heart of this wilderness, two people who had come together under unusual circumstances were discovering a truth they could no longer ignore. The pretend arrangement had grown into something real, fragile, and powerful, capable of altering both their lives forever. Winter had settled deeply into the mountains. The peaks were coated with thick snow. The trees bowed under icy blankets, and the air carried the sharp, clear chill that made every breath feel alive.
Life had become harsher, more demanding, but Clara had grown used to it. The mountains no longer felt like a temporary challenge. They had become her home, at least for now.
Eli and Clara's days were filled with the routine of survival, yet the rhythm had changed. Their cooperation was seamless. Each knew the other's movements, thoughts, and unspoken signals. The pretend arrangement they had agreed to months ago was no longer just a pretense. The boundary lines they had set had blurred, almost vanished, replaced by mutual trust, care, and quiet affection. Both of them had recognized it, though neither had spoken the words aloud. One morning, Clara woke to find a thick layer of frost covering the cabin windows. The sun had not yet risen, and the world outside was quiet, almost still. She dressed quickly, layering herself in wool and canvas, and stepped outside to check the small garden they had managed to keep alive.
Despite the cold, life persisted. Tiny shoots of green stubbornly pushed through the frozen soil, reminding her that even in harsh conditions, growth was possible.
Eli joined her silently, his breath forming clouds in the crisp morning air. He handed her a mug of warm tea without speaking. Clara accepted it with a smile. These small gestures had become a comfort, a language of their own that needed no words.
Cold enough for you?
He asked finally, his voice low but not harsh.
Cold enough to make me appreciate tea even more. They worked together, clearing paths and stacking wood for the stove. Even in the physical labor, there was a sense of companionship that had grown between them.
Clara realized that she had stopped thinking of him as simply the mountain man who had asked her to pretend to be his wife. He was now someone whose presence she had come to rely on, someone whose opinion mattered and whose safety concerned her deeply. As the day progressed, they prepared for a trip into the forest to gather firewood. The snow made travel slow and dangerous, but Eli moved with ease, scouting ahead and guiding Clara carefully. The cold bit at their fingers and noses. Yet they worked efficiently, silently acknowledging each other's strength and skill. At one point, Clara slipped on a patch of ice, and Eli caught her immediately, pulling her close to steady her. "Careful," he said quietly, his eyes scanning her for any sign of injury. "I'm fine," she replied, her heart racing for reasons beyond the fall. She felt a warmth spread through her chest at the closeness, a feeling she could no longer ignore or deny.
After gathering enough wood, they made their way back to the cabin.
As they rested by the fire sipping hot tea, Clara finally spoke the words she had been holding back. "I never expected any of this," she said softly.
When I came here, I thought it would be about surviving, about observing the forest. I didn't expect to feel like this, to care like I do.
Eli looked at her, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. For a moment he said nothing, simply studying her face. Then he spoke, his voice low and steady.
I didn't either. I thought I could keep everything.
Simple. Pretend only. Remember.
I didn't expect to notice or to care the way I do. Clara felt a shiver run through her, but this time it was not from the cold. It was from the truth in his words, the recognition that they had crossed the boundary they had agreed upon, and that neither wanted to turn back. The days that followed were filled with a quiet, growing intimacy.
They cooked meals together, repaired the cabin, and ventured into the forest, but now there was an unspoken understanding between them. Small touches lingered a little longer, glances carried weight, and words of concern were spoken without hesitation.
They no longer needed to pretend. The bond they had formed was real, tested by the harshness of the mountains and the challenges of survival.
One evening, as snow fell gently around the cabin, Clara found herself sitting on the porch, wrapped in a thick blanket.
Eli joined her, carrying 2 mugs of steaming tea. He handed her one, and they sat in silence, watching the snowflakes drift lazily to the ground.
I never imagined I could feel peace like this, Clara said quietly. Even with all the cold, the work, the challenges, I feel alive, and I think it's because of you.
Eli's expression softened, and he took a slow sip of tea. It's been the same for me, he admitted.
I thought I wanted solitude. I thought I wanted distance from everyone. But I can't imagine this place without you. I can't imagine facing it alone.
Clara's heart swelled at his words. The mountains had taught them both lessons about strength, patience, survival, and the value of trust.
But more than that, they had learned about connection, about the courage to open their hearts when it was frightening and uncertain. As winter deepened, they faced more challenges.
Heavy snowfall blocked paths, storms made the forest dangerous, and the cabin required constant maintenance to withstand the cold. Yet through it all, they worked as a team, each relying on the other's skills and judgment. Clara had become strong and capable, and Eli had begun to share the burden of solitude, finding in her presence a comfort he had not known for years. One particularly cold morning, Clara woke to find Eli preparing breakfast. The smell of warm bread and sizzling vegetables filled the cabin, and she felt a deep sense of gratitude. Life here was hard, demanding, and unpredictable, yet it was also full of moments of beauty, of small joys that were often overlooked in the city.
Good morning, Eli said, his voice gentle. Sleep well. Better than I have in a long time, the mountains. They make everything feel different.
Eli nodded, pouring her a cup of tea.
Different, yes, but real. Life here doesn't hide from you. It's honest, even when it's harsh. You've learned that, and I see it in you.
You've grown.
I couldn't have done it without you. Eli looked away, a faint smile touching his lips. And I couldn't have done it without you either. I didn't know it at first, but I've needed someone. More than I realized.
The snow continued to fall outside, and they ate their breakfast in companionable silence.
There was no rush, no pretense, only the quiet understanding that they had both changed, and that their connection was now something real, permanent, and cherished. In the days that followed, Clara and Eli began to speak more openly about the future. The pretend arrangement had served its purpose, and the village matter it was meant to address was resolved.
Yet neither of them wanted to part ways. The mountains had brought them together in a way neither could have anticipated, and the bond they shared was too valuable to ignore.
One afternoon, while clearing snow from the cabin roof, Clara slipped on the icy surface. Eli caught her immediately, pulling her close to steady her. Their eyes met, and for the first time there was no pretense, no hesitation. The connection between them was undeniable.
You're mine, Eli said quietly, a gentle firmness in his voice. Not pretend. Not temporary. I don't want to face this life without you.
Clara's heart raced, and she felt a mixture of relief, joy, and certainty. I don't want to either, she whispered.
I'm not pretending anymore.
The winter pressed on, but the cabin was warm, filled with laughter, conversation, and the quiet comfort of shared life. They explored the forest together, repaired the cabin, and prepared for the months ahead, knowing that the mountains would continue to test them, but confident that they would face those challenges side by side. As the days grew shorter and the nights colder, Clara realized how much she had changed since arriving in the mountains. She had come seeking adventure and study, but she had found something far greater: trust, partnership, and love.
Eli, the rugged mountain man, had taught her the value of resilience, patience, and understanding. And she had, in turn, shown him the importance of connection, companionship, and the courage to open his heart.
One quiet evening, as the snow fell softly outside, they sat together by the stove. Clara leaned her head on Eli's shoulder, feeling the warmth of his presence.
Outside, the mountains stretched endlessly, their peaks illuminated by the moonlight. Inside, the cabin was a sanctuary, a place where two people brought together by circumstance had discovered something profound and lasting.
"This life, it's not what I expected," Clara said softly.
Eli wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. "Neither did I, but it's better than I could have imagined."
"With you, it's enough. More than enough."
And in the silence of the mountains with snow falling gently around them, Clara and Eli understood that their journey had brought them not just survival, but a connection that was real, enduring, and worth every hardship they had faced. They had come together under unusual circumstances, but they would continue together, facing the mountains, the storms, and the quiet days, bound by trust, respect, and a love that had grown stronger than either could have foreseen.
The mountains had tested them, changed them, and ultimately brought them together. And in that rugged, beautiful wilderness they had found a home. Not just in the cabin, not just in the forest, but in each other,